Welcome back to the Jew 23 community. It is a podcast for those who are curious or confused about all things Christianity. I'm Jeremiah, and along with me is our host, Nick Hardcastle. And together, we are diving into God's Word piece by piece, figuring out all the themes and trying to see where exactly the Lord is leading humanity in his ongoing work of redemption here in the world. Nick, how are you doing?
Doing good, brother. Just happy to be back here. Happy to be back in the story about Noah, and excited to get into the word today with you. How are you, man?
I'm good. I'm busy, and it's been a day. I was telling you a little bit before we got on camera how sometimes my days are so compartmentalized. By the end of the day, something that I thought maybe happened a day or two ago, really just happened this morning, and so I think I lived like multiple days in the same day because this morning I had to take my wife's van to get a new windshield installed. And so that was a task in and of itself. We first bought that van several years ago, brand new. And within the first week, we had multiple rock chips on it from
Oh,
driving on the highway. And so I told her, I said, hey, if we're going to get rock chips like this on the windshield this often, I don't want to replace the windshield and just have to do it again.
mm-hmm.
So we just kept putting it off because we could still drive it and just little nicks here and there. But we went through the car wash the other day and all of them just all of a sudden spidered from one
Oh,
end of the windshield to the other. I was like, oh, well, maybe it's time to get that new windshield now.
yeah.
So that's what I got to do this morning.
That way the water wasn't coming in the vehicle with you. I'm kind of the opposite. I usually think at the end of the day something that I was supposed to do earlier in the day that I didn't get done. So
Yeah.
different level of compartmentalization. Mine is forgetfulness. So yeah.
Well, each season brings about its own levels of either do's or don'ts. So
Yeah, its own
always
chips in the windshield, right?
that's exactly right. Well, hey, let's go ahead and dive in and start knocking this thing out. Last week, we left the story with a lot of tension. This
Mm-hmm.
idea that God regretted making mankind and he was ready to just wipe it all clean. And then today, well, specifically in verse 8, so chapter 6, verse 7, he said, I regretted all of this and I'm ready to just wipe a clean slate and start all over again, or maybe just not even have creation any longer at all.
Mm-hmm.
But then in verse 8, it says, But then Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Do you remember back in chapter 5 what Noah's name means?
Uh, it means like the one that will bring us peace, or the
Right.
one that will bring us rest, right?
Rest, comfort, peace,
Yeah.
all of those. Yeah. And so this is what's interesting about that is we walk through Genesis 5 and in talking about how man had been kind of destined this mortal sorrow, but there's going to come one down that'll teach him that his death will bring about the rest and restoration of all things. And we see that from our vantage point as a prophecy about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But little did the people in Genesis 6 know that this was going to be Noah who was going to bring about a type of salvation as well. So let's go ahead
Yeah.
and jump into.
Real quick, real quick
Yeah,
on
go ahead.
that. Sorry. So at it, all this, just getting some real day seven creation vibes, and I think
Right.
that's God rested on the last day. And I think that also helps set up some context for the story that we're about to go into. So
Hmm.
maybe it's also like his name sounded like rest. He would bring this comfort. He would bring this rest. But he was bringing us back to the foundation of how the Lord made the earth. And I think that we're
Right.
going to see a little bit of that as we're kind of going into this next story. So that just popped up top of my mind, trying to remember where we've been so far in our last five chapters. Don't forget the
Yeah.
fact that the thing that the Lord ordained and kept going at the end of creation was rest. and Noah
Mhm.
is all of a sudden popping back up in that same vein.
Well, yeah, in chapter 5, verse 29, he says, I'm going to call his name Noah, saying, this one will comfort us concerning our work and our toil and the toil of our hands, because the ground of the Lord is cursed, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And even understanding Noah's name, the idea of rest, Lamech, his dad, was probably thinking, this one's going to bring us comfort and rest
Yeah.
from the work that we have to do when we toil with the ground because of the Lord's because of the ground that the Lord cursed. But when you look at it from the perspective that you just shared, he he missed the boat completely,
Yeah.
because God is not using Noah to rescue them from their work, but he's using Noah to say, listen, you were never meant for this work in the first place. Toil
Yes.
and striving, what or work and toil was never supposed to be your identity. And for Noah to bring rest means I'm going to separate you from that identity and reestablish the identity of rest in your life the way it was
Yeah.
to be.
Yeah. A new creation, a new Garden of Eden.
There it is.
Back to the basics, as we might say.
Yeah. Nope. That's exactly right. Yeah. So chapter 6, verse 8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Verse
Mm-hmm.
9. So this is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all the flesh had corrupted their ways on the earth. What an interesting portion of Scripture. Um, Before I dive into anything, Nick, what stands out to you in those 3 or 4 verses?
You go first because I just saw a highlighted footnote that I have in my Bible that I want to go back and read. So
Okay, go for it.
after you.
I'm going to start in verse 9, and he says, this is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generation. And then Noah walked with God. Who else do we know that walked with God?
Oh, Adam.
Adam walked with God. That's good. Who else?
Well, who else? Well, I mean, I
Yeah.
guess Eve in the garden, him, Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
I mean, are you saying up to this point right now, or later
Yeah.
on?
There's a significant person who walked with God, and he actually never tasted death.
Yeah. You talking about? Oh shoot,
Talking
heritage,
about Mr.
Methuselah,
Enoch.
Enoch. That was it. Yeah.
I'm trying to
Okay.
see where his story was. Okay, so to Enoch was born Irad, and then Irad begat Mehujael. Methuselah, we got Lamech, Lamech. Yeah, I don't know where that story was at, where it says that Enoch walked with God and then he was no more.
Enoch. Sorry, I'm trying to join you now too.
No, you're good. This awkward silence isn't always the best for podcasting,
No.
but it is definitely good for Bible study.
Yeah. 5:22 through 24. That is where we
Okay.
found Mr. Enoch in there. And when Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God, and after he fathered Methuselah 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He was not.
Yeah. He was not, because God took him. So Genesis 5, 24.
Yeah, Genesis
I'm going to
5:24.
see what those verses look like in the Hebrew.
Whenever you pull this, whenever you bring it back up in the Hebrew, how about you reread it real quick, because when we move to our audio version, I'm going to cut some of this dead silence out if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it just means to walk. It's a primitive root. Yeah, so apparently what this is saying. So here's the connection I was trying to make. It says that Noah was different than his generation. It says that he was perfect in his generation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Perfection doesn't mean moral perfection.
No.
Perfection doesn't mean without sin perfection. And so this concept of perfection has to do with the next sentence. So Noah was perfect in his generation, and Noah walked with God. So the thing that makes Noah perfect wasn't that he was morally perfect or sinless in the sense, but there was something about him walking with God that set him apart from everybody else in his generation.
Yeah. I think the qualification itself is the fact that Noah actually walked with God. So I think what God, who's trying to break this story down and tell us a little bit more about it, is saying that the simple fact that, Noah had mistakes. Noah had his shortcomings. Noah had all of these shortcomings, but he was blameless or perfect in his generation because he did what God asked them to do back in the Garden of Eden. And whenever you go
Right.
back in the Garden of Eden, you get to that one part in that one verse, and the Lord saying, "Where are you?" And the Lord wasn't trying to and say that he had misplaced Adam and Eve at that point in time. He was trying to say, "You're not where you were supposed to be. You're supposed to be sitting here right beside me, walking with me." So I think really what we're seeing come to life right here is that Noah had gone throughout this generation, being in the line of Seth, and and I'm going to just go ahead and infer. It
Mhm.
doesn't really tell us, but we talked a couple of episodes ago about continuation of the curse in Adam, or
Mhm.
continuation of the partnership with continuation of the curse Adam to Cain,
Okay.
continuation of the partnership Adam to Abel. I'm gonna
Mhm.
assume that after Adam saw these two sons grow up, he was able to go ahead and learn and continue in his learning from that. And I'm going to assume that Seth probably was at least of this similar lineage, that he continued in a path of partnering with God and stewarding the earth. So I'm
Mm.
going to just sit here and say that what I kind of see starting to pop out in this, it's not that Noah was blameless. It's not that Noah was perfect, even though it says that in the text. It's that Noah was doing the thing that he was supposed to do from the beginning, that humanity was supposed to do from the beginning. That was
Yeah.
walking with the Lord and then pursuing him in order to be able to keep his covenant with the world holy.
Yeah. And when you look at that word perfect, uh, I'm going to just pronounce tamim. It's the Hebrew word, and it means to be complete, whole, entirety, sound, healthful, um, unimpaired. And so the idea of Noah being perfect in his generation probably is signifying that Noah was the only person in his generation walking in that wholeness with God, walking with God the way that Adam walked with God, walking with God the way that Abel walked with God, walking with God the way that Enoch walked with God. What's interesting about this is that, and I'm gonna take a little bit of a turn here, how in every generation there's always one man who is choosing to walk with God,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it makes me wonder, what if in our generation, if nobody else is walking with God, what if God was calling us to be that man, to walk with him? What if we were the only person who was willing to walk with God the same way that Adam and Abel and Noah, and we look even in the future that Elijah was walking with God,
Yeah.
to hear his voice, to know his heart, to walk with him effortlessly and blamelessly. I say effortlessly because when the Lord draws you near, there is an element when it becomes your identity, when you lay down the curse, when you lay down
Hmm.
the toil and surrender it to Him, picking up the identity that God is handing you is an effortless thing because He is the one that does all the work. And so it makes me wonder when I look at Noah, who is the one man in his generation that is walking with God, that all the other earth is completely corrupt. But he himself had made the choice to receive the invitation to continue to partner with God, to walk with God, to be the man that God desires to use for such a time as that. What kind of example does that set for us in order to be the person in our generation that's going to walk with God in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is a pretty strong message in and of itself. Especially whenever you just kind of sit there and say, like, is my partnership significant? And then if you really just change the way that you view your partnership, and when I say the partnership, I'm talking about partnership with the Lord. Is my
Yeah.
partnership with the Lord significant? The
Right.
thing that this man or that all these other men, women, whoever, like whoever was been throughout this entire story did was
Hmm.
that they laid down enough of themselves for the
Hmm.
Lord's work to shine and for the Lord's work to stand out. Um,
Yeah.
they allowed themselves to be different and get uncomfortable enough in their own situations that they only felt comfortable letting the Lord lead them throughout the entirety of the story. So I think this is
Yeah.
really the defining characteristic of Noah.
Right. Right. And I just think, man, if my life was written about, would that be the defining characteristic of my life? We talk about that. Like, what's it going to say on your tombstone, right? I don't know. I'm probably going to get cremated, right? I can come up with all kinds of excuses. But if somebody were to, if God were to lead somebody to narrate a story about my life, would that be the characteristic of my narrative that Jeremiah stood out amongst a generation and walked with God?
Yeah, that's a tough one to wrestle with. I guess we can say for you, what's it going to say on your urn? But I actually, the
Right.
first thing that popped up in my mind was I'm just going to get cremated, so I don't have to say what's going to be on my tombstone. But you cut that out. But I mean, there's some seriousness about this.
Right.
Um, because whether it be in life or in this life or the continuation of this life, in New Jerusalem and heaven, whatever have you, there will
Yeah.
be an account, and that account is largely going to be based off of the works that you've done. So it's not a call just to sit there and say, well, my story wouldn't be as good as Noah's. It's an account
Hmm.
to say that you took these works and you were able to advance my kingdom this much.
Right.
Sometimes it's a huge story of refinement, like that we see in Noah right here. Sometimes
Right.
it's the little things, like a demon possessed man going and spreading the word of God after he's been healed. But there will
Hmm.
be an account. So the big thing about it is, that I think is just as important, does the Lord value the little accounts that were for his kingdom differently than he does the big accounts? Because
Mm.
I would sit there and say that let's just go ahead and lay out the entirety of the Bible. Noah, Moses, David, and then Jesus would probably be the ones that you could just significantly say out. These are the ones that impacted humanity.
Right.
But
Right.
does Jeremiah, does Nick's story please the Lord any differently if we walk with the Lord?
Well, and that's the big part because all of this was written about Noah before the whole story of the ark. because it wasn't so much about the major accomplishment that he had over the course of his life. It was that Noah walked with God on a daily basis.
Yeah,
That's what I think is hugely important to recognize, because I think a lot of people like myself would look at Noah's life, and the only defining marker on his life, I'm like, oh yeah, the ark. He built the ark. Noah's flood. Blah blah blah. But the reality of it is the defining attribute of his life was that Noah walked with God.
yeah. I mean, most of the rest of this narrative is largely about what God did. What God
Right.
was trying to tell the people was that before that Noah did all this, he was qualified because he walked with me. I mean,
Yeah.
Noah didn't even shut the door to the ark. I don't know, but I would slightly imagine that the Lord helped Noah build this ark in some form or fashion. But
Oh yeah.
um, he is trying to tell, and I guess I mean, continuing back to the timeline of where we're at, he's trying to tell these people that he has delivered, that his qualification for this man to reshape and save the earth was that he was blameless because he walked with God. And I
Hmm.
think we so often just forget about that. That we think that there's honestly something else that we have to have, like some it factor that we have to have.
Right.
And
Right.
God defined what the it factor was right there in verse 9.
Yeah. And he said, just walk with me.
Yeah.
Be a child of the promise, not a child of the curse, but partner with me in the promise and enter that rest, and everything else is going to take care of itself.
Yep.
That's good. Let's look at verse 11. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. What do you think it means when it says that the earth itself, the earth was corrupt?
Yeah.
Do you think that means like the physical ground was somehow corrupted?
I don't personally think that it would be that the physical ground had been corrupted. I don't know if you can personally corrupt the ground, but one of the big things that pops out to me goes back to Genesis chapter 3, whenever the Lord says, I can hear, or I'm sorry, that would be Genesis chapter 4. Whenever the Lord says, the blood of your brother is calling out from the ground. What is that where it's at? Yeah, so in Genesis chapter 4, verse 10, then it says, and the Lord said, and this is directed towards Cain, and the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. What have you done?
Hmm.
So I don't think that it's specifically what this sticks out to me is that the ground was corrupted. It's that there had been so much abuse, so much violence, so much murder, so much so much sin that had gone in this downward spiraling confusion over these
Hmm.
many years. I don't know, hundreds, maybe over 1,000 years. You probably
Right.
know the timeline a little bit better than I do, but over these hundreds of years there was enough sin that it honestly had probably covered the face of the earth. And
Hmm.
then that ground was corrupted. It was saying that it had just, there was not a really a bit of it that hadn't been abused, hadn't been taken from its glory with the Lord, and then transformed into the kingdom of empire with man. I don't. That's what it kind of sticks out to me. That's the way it sounds. It seems like
Yeah.
there's a continuation of the curse just going on that has really just spread throughout the entirety of the world.
Well, I like what you said about the bloodshed, about making the connection with Abel and the Lord saying, "Where's your brother? His blood is crying out for me, out to me from the earth." That there was, I mean, verse um, 11 said that the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and that the whole earth was filled with violence. And so, this idea of the whole earth being filled with violence and how much blood was being shed on the earth, that blood would be crying out to God, or the earth would be crying out to God because of how much blood had been shed throughout creation of it. Like, it's incredible to me, the level of, I guess, contamination, and not like that we understand it, like pollution or things like that, but that purity, because creation was created with a sense of purity involved, and the purity was contaminated with bloodshed from the violence that had spread all over the earth.
Yeah. And if we think about really how, and this has just kind of popped up in my mind right now, we talk about like cities and how
Hmm.
like Cain built a city, and then there was likely people who were coming and taking over cities and taking over kingdoms. A lot of the times, of what they would do is they would build upon the old city. They would sack it, and they would build upon it, and it would be kind of just this continuous building of like this city on a hill. Well, the hill was
Hmm.
pretty much everything that they had destroyed underneath it.
Right.
So you've honestly, the way that it seems like to me, whenever you're saying you're crying out, it was the people who had been abused that were crying out. It
Yeah.
was the people who were pretty much the collateral damage of this were crying out. What we're seeing right here is what's popping out to me as that sin had mobilized in such a fashion that it had spread over the entirety of the earth, that everywhere you would go underneath it was a pile of people that had been abused, of people who had
Mm.
been taken advantage of animals who had been, wrongfully treated, whatever, God's kingdom, trees, whatever it is, they had been sacked. So honestly, to where it kind of comes to me at this, it's honestly kind of like the way that I think about it, if you would just see one of those apocalyptic type movies, maybe like the
Hmm.
apocalyptic type movies with the earth, when there's just this nasty turmoil and nothing is good around. I think humanity's sin had become such a plague on the earth at that point in time that it had mobilized enough that the earth was corrupted in itself, and there was nothing that you couldn't that you could do to separate yourself from this in some form.
Mm. You know what's interesting about that? This is what makes me think about is I hear people all the time say things like, um, why concerning sin, when we're talking about sin of some kind, they're like, well, why is this even such a big deal? Because I'm not hurting anyone. And so there's this element that we think, oh, the sins, even if I know that they're sins, the sins that I commit, they're not really hurting anyone. It's like a victimless crime. It's not really hurting anybody. But what we don't understand is that those sins continue to contribute to the corruption that is ongoing, corrupting the earth. And we have to ask ourselves, do we want to be the kind of people who continuously contribute to the corruption of the earth? And like you said, we can allow ourselves to kind of be sucked into this culture of it, that we find ourselves in the middle of it, whether we want to or not. And I think that has a lot of cultural implications today, probably even more than what we can even talk about in one episode. But the idea that we could be just sucked in to the point that, well, we're not really hurting anybody, but and the process of being sucked in, we are continuously contributing to the corruption of the earth and allowing that corruption to spread to the point where I don't know, I lost that thought.
No, I think it's a good thought, because if you think about it, we've talked about. Sorry, I need to speak directly into the mic, as I've learned through editing. I turned my head away to look outside. Um, we talk about the start of sin, and in the physical sin that occurred itself was that a man and woman both ate a piece of
Mhm.
fruit, or
Right.
of the bearing of a tree that they weren't supposed to eat, the seed of a tree they weren't supposed to eat. They both ate some fruit. Did the act of eating fruit hurt anybody?
No.
No. So, I mean, we have to kind of remember it in the same vein of that. The act itself, it can be much bigger and have much bigger implications than just the fact, the ease and the smallness of the action can have some huge implications associated with it.
Mhm.
So, and I think one thing that really stands out about this is that it had transformed into violence. And there's something really big that pops out about this. And I'm going to just read a little bit farther, if you don't mind. I'm going to start back up in verse 11. It said, "Now
Yeah.
the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them." So he specifically, in this little introduction to this flood narrative, where we've been so far is we've talked about how Noah was blameless, how he was different, and what the qualifications were to be able to
Hmm.
do something great. That was walking with God. He also gives us a qualification for why he did it. The qualification was that the earth was filled with violence, and that violence had corrupted the entirety of the world through death, through murder, through all this stuff like this.
Right.
So it's not that that little sin was the thing that it led to. It was that little sin sparked something to be so much greater, kind of like a downward spiral, until you get to the end of that sin mobilizes and is so big that it just simply overwhelms everything and results in violence.
Right. And this is the question that resonates in my mind because people want to immediately look at God and say, how terrible is it of God to regret making humanity and want to wipe the earth completely clean of all of it? Like, how dare he? Right. So we take on this moral posture, the superior moral posture, but we have no idea what that looks like, what it looks like to be so corrupt and so violent that the entire earth has been corrupted by the bloodshed that has taken place. And if God would have chosen not to do anything, our assessment of God would have still been the same. Because that's kind of the essence of how we know that we are in sin, is because we ourselves take on the judgment, or actually, we ourselves take on the position of God as judge, and we start to judge God based on what we think we would have done. So, what would you have done if the whole earth was covered in sin and violence? Right? Let's bring the picture down. What would you do as a parent if you had four children and all four of your children were constantly creating an incredible amount of violence? That bloodshed was happening everywhere that they walked. That they just walked together and just constantly were creating violence and bloodshed and murder and corruption in every culture and part of the world that they were in. They were just constantly causing that. And I don't know if that's really a good analogy, but what would you do? Would
Yeah.
you just say, well, family's family and you got to support family? Or would you take action to bring justice? Because when we look at kind of the identity of Noah, the part of his is perfect man in his generation. So what did that mean? That means that he had a sense of justice that the rest of his generation didn't have. So how are we going to stand in judgment of God based on what God did? Or if it would have been the opposite, we would have still stood in judgment of God based on what he didn't do. Like, how do we bring ourselves to that position where we think we can judge God for the decisions that he's made?
Yeah. And the other part about this is that we don't talk about the victims of this as well.
Right.
We like to point out that how could God destroy these people for doing this? We don't point out the victims. Um,
Yeah.
Even though Noah was the one who was righteous and who walked blamelessly with God, there's always especially whenever you get to these violent crimes, there is a victim of it. It's not like
Yeah.
the fact that we had like two equally matched grizzly bears going at each other in every situation like this. There was abuse.
Hmm.
There was people that were being taken advantage of. And yes, the Lord destroyed them too in this flood. But how would it feel to sit there and also say that you continued this on and that we have a God that he just lets this happen. You know, the big part about it is, and you can see this type of stuff just even in today's world, people who are a victim, people who need help, people who are in a helpless situation. And I kind of sit there and say, is it right to let that helpless situation continue whenever the helpless
Right.
situation was the entirety of the earth? It's not just who are we to sit there and say, you know, if you are God, how would you do this? If you would sit there and say that you made these children, you made this
Mhm.
earth, and they have totally abused it and totally messed it all up. But not only that, but they're innocent people who are the victim of these crimes right here. How would you handle it? Would you just let it keep on going? Because that raises a lot of red flags to me that shows a God of love. I think a
Right.
God of love reestablishes the story in the way that he feels is most appropriate.
Yeah, and I don't think we understand just how much, um because I don't think we understand just how much patience that he shows in the desire to see people turn away from their sin and turn away from their violence, turn away from their corruption, turn away from their chaos, whatever it is. We almost always see God as this uh, judgmental, um, just vengeful God. And what we don't realize is how much patience he shows us in the process of desiring that we turn. We'll see this later on in the story, where, you know, God was going to bring, um, was it was after the Exodus that God was going to bring, um, no, it was beforehand. Oh man, my timeline is screwed
No,
up.
it was after the Exodus.
Yeah.
When
And he
Moses said,
said,
we'll
and
start
he's,
it over.
what's
Go
that?
ahead. When he told Moses, we'll just start over with you.
Yeah, 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 but there was one line in there. He said, um, "The the sin of the Amalekites have not yet, or maybe it was Canaanites. The sin of the Canaanites have not yet reached its reached its fullness." And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Well, it meant this: that God's patience for the Canaanites, He was willing to be patient to see if they would turn from their sin before He executed His judgment on them. And in the same way, I have a feeling that we're seeing the same picture here in the time of Noah, that even though man had been destined this mortal sorrow, God had been patient with man, with the hopes that they would figure out how to to turn around and start calling on the name of the Lord, like we saw earlier in the chapters, and that he would see not just a man within a generation walking with God, but that he would see the whole generation walking with God. We see this true in the story of Abraham when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham's
Mm-hmm.
just like, hey, what if there was like 20 people, 20 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah? And God's like, hey, if there were 20 people, I would spare them. And he's like, well, what if there were 10 righteous people? Hey, if there were 10 righteous people, I would spare them. Why? Because 10 righteous people can change an entire city. 10 righteous people can change an entire country, an entire nation, an entire culture, an entire everything. Like God knows what can happen with just a handful of righteous people. The problem comes when there are no more righteous people to be had. And when there are no more righteous people to be had, then what is God supposed to do? What is
Yeah.
God supposed to do with a people who are constantly corrupted by the flesh, by sin, by violence, and by whatever else that is causing and victimizing people in a sense of injustice? And but there's no righteous person to stand up and counter that injustice and fight against it. What is God supposed to do in that scenario? And what God does do is he executes justice on the situation, just like a good God would and should, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he did it, so I guess we could say should. But the big thing about it is, and I really like where you went. He's not looking. He doesn't have to have all these people. It's all about the remnant. He
Right.
overcomes greater situations with less qualified people than than any way better than anyone possible. Um, so it's one of those things that I think that it's really important for us to be able to set in mind right here. What kind of God could do this? The one who's willing to take one man and start back over. Because that's what he did, is he took just a small remnant and said that you have partnered with me and you still trusted me through all of this. And after you've seen all this, and I honestly probably would sit there and say that, are we even like Noah? Like, do we have a fiber of our being inside of us that if this was our world all the way around us, and it goes back to the same thing you were talking about earlier, like what would it be on your tombstone? What would it be? Could we even in our present day situation be like Noah? You know, you see war, you see all this other stuff, you see everything go in the middle of it. But Noah didn't give up. Noah
Right.
honestly sat there and said, I'm standing here with you in the middle of this because I know something about your character and I know something about this is worth kind of partnering with. So, one thing, and I know that we're kind of probably pressing in for a little bit of time, but I think it's important to take a good contextual understanding of this going into it. And I'd like to think about some of your thoughts on this, Jeremiah.
Okay. Shoot.
Um, so God really goes into a very, very long narrative following this, starting in verse 13, ending in verse 22. And I think there's one significant thing in there that I'll pull out here in a little bit, but it's also Noah's response. It says, Noah did this, he did all that commanded. It's pretty common in the Bible for them to be able to sit there and say that if there is a narrative, if there is something that's happening, if there's something that is going on, Noah would respond. Noah's response, and we know that the Lord found enough value in recording Noah's response later, because he records a really long rant that he has. He records some words that, or he transfers some words that Noah had back then to his people. But
Hmm.
Noah's response is that he moves.
Hmm.
So honestly, when we start trying to talk about the character that the Lord is looking for, we talk about Noah's qualification being the fact that he walked with the Lord. But even after all this, after he told him that he was going to destroy humanity, he was going to destroy mankind, and Noah, you're going to get on this boat and you're going to be the last one left with your family and you're going to be able to survive. What is Noah's response is just honestly just as much powerful as the fact that the Lord brought us through this. It's that just Noah did it and he moved, and he didn't sit there and question the Lord.
Right.
Because I think a lot of the time we sit there and our first response is that we question the Lord. And the Lord can take our questions, whatever questions we have, you can throw it at him. But whenever it really gets to the true character of somebody that can really be enough to be able to bring humanity in a complete different directions, he doesn't even sit there and contemplate on how to, question the Lord for who he is. He just says, your will be done.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty defining characteristic to me. I don't know. Does it make you think of anything, Jeremiah?
Well, I'm jumping way ahead to the future. When you have Zechariah and Elizabeth, and Zechariah, God tells Zechariah that Elizabeth is going to be pregnant with John the Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, "What? That's crazy. How's this going to happen? I'm such an old woman." Right. And then Mary, the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and says, "Hey, you're going to be pregnant with Jesus." And she essentially asks the same question, like, how's this going to happen? But the motivation of the question was totally different. Elizabeth was saying, how is this going to happen? Right? Like, I'm too old. This is impossible. I'm not going to, I'm not going to, like, I just can't even wrap my mind about it. How is this going to happen? Right. So there was an element of doubt involved in that. But then with Mary, she's like, okay, but how is this going to happen? She's thinking to herself, I know how people get pregnant. And you're telling me I'm going to get pregnant. Do you want me to get pregnant? Or like she's asking for direction, she's asking for instruction, which in turn is showing her faith. And
Mm-hmm.
so when the Lord leads us into something that seems either big, we don't know how to comprehend it, or it seems so impossible, we don't even know where to go, we can ask the same question, but the question can either be motivated from doubt or motivated for instruction, right? So we could say, how is this going to happen? With that idea, like, this is impossible, this is unrealistic, this is illogical, this could never happen. So how's this really going to happen? Or we could come from a place of instruction, like, yes, Lord, I'm here. I'll do whatever you want me to do, but what's my next step? Like, I don't want to just start running into this willy nilly. I need you to kind of direct me into what my next steps are. Like, how do you want me to go about in doing this? So yes, God can handle your questions. God wants you to ask him your questions. The difference being, your
Mm-hmm.
questions can't come as a means of doubt or an expression of doubt. Your questions should come as a request for instruction, direction, and guidance. And that kind of question is a question fueled by faith.
Yeah. And I think often in the middle of God telling us that he's going to do something, he also provides the answer.
Yeah.
Provides the answer for a bunch of questions. We just have to go back and you see it hindsight and you're like, well, it was right there in front of me the whole time.
Right.
And I mean, you had some good dialogue about in the future. I'm going to go ahead and pull it back to a dialogue that we've seen right here, the one that we were just going over. And I want to just go ahead and pull out a couple of verses that I think we glaze over, but I think Noah took them to heart, and is that he didn't question. He probably sat there and thought in his own mind. I think he was sitting there, it's like, well, am I going to get off this boat? Because God talks about a flood
Right.
coming. He doesn't talk about the resolution of it ever in this narrative. I mean, he legitimately said you're going to get on this boat, and I didn't say that the water was going to stop in this.
Hmm.
Um, so jumping back in the word, Genesis 6, verse 17. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which the breath of life in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. So there's something that's really important. Two things I want to pull out of that. Number one, you see the some verbiage that I think is very important that pulls us back to the creation of man. And he talked about the breath of life being in everything, the spirit of the
Hmm.
Lord. So I think we're seeing right here that there is that spirit moving, and it's going to be
Yeah.
moving from land onto this ark. But there's also a thing that stands out here that I think God answered Noah's question, and Noah was cognizant enough to listen to the Lord in such detail that he didn't have to ask the question, are you going to get me off this ark? Because it
Right.
says, but I will establish my covenant with you.
Hmm.
And we're going to have a little bit of this is somewhat, I guess, a spoiler alert of what's coming up in the future. But Noah gets on this boat, and there's a long time that passes, and Noah doesn't lose doubt. He knows he's going to have coming off the other side, because unless the Lord were to sit there and establish his covenant on that boat, there has to be a covenant established somewhere else. And I think if Noah is sitting here understanding the entirety of the thing that the Lord was telling him, whenever he had just talked about the breath of life, and the last time that the Lord had established a covenant in this similar manner, referring to the breath of life, he did this in a garden. He did this back to the perfection of creation. He did this back to where he had started it all. So I think Noah understood without even asking God a single word, just by being cognizant enough to listen and to trust him, that he was going to be dragging him back to somewhere different, somewhere where
Hmm.
humanity was at perfect peace with God. where they were established with him in a garden. And Noah would just sit there saying that I know this covenant's coming, so I'm going to get on this boat because you're going to drag me to the other side and you're going to have a resolution. And it's going to be a beautiful one too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. Let me read to you Hebrews 11, verse 7. And by faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. And by this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. And I think this is the most important thing that we have to understand was that Noah, being perfect and righteous in his generation, that perfection came from walking with God, and the righteousness came by having faith in everything that God instructed him to do.
Mm-hmm.
We receive our righteousness not because of what we do, but we receive our righteousness because of who we trust. The righteousness that we receive is the righteousness that comes from Christ and Christ alone. And I think that's a good place to really wrap up that the
Mm-hmm.
righteousness that Noah had was a righteousness that God had given him and that he received by faith. And that same righteousness that we can have, that same perfection, the same wholeness that we can have, comes to us from walking with the Lord, crying out to the Lord, listening to the Lord, even the things that don't make sense, trusting and obeying. And that is where we will find ourselves happy in Jesus alone. Rant over. Oh, some of these passages that we read through, like I've read through a dozen times, and for whatever reason, reading through them like we are right now, it's just so much stuff coming out.
Yeah. Uh, we're going to have to start making some good decisions on how we're going to get to the rest of this chunks of this Bible because we might not be alive by the end we get to it. So,
Maybe so.
but
And
that's
it's not
okay.
necessarily fair because Genesis, I think, is my favorite book in all of Scripture.
Oh, it's mine too. There's some stuff in here that we're gonna probably do some fair skippage over. And there's some other stuff that we'll dive in deeper like this on.
Yep, indeed, indeed. All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining us again on the Jude 23 Community Podcast, a podcast for those who are curious or confused about all things Christianity. I'm Jeremiah Wood along with Nick Hartcastle, and this was episode 9. Thanks for joining us.